The guns fell silent over Crimea, but the echoes of the war lingered across Europe for generations. The Crimean War had begun as a clash of empires over influence, religion, and power. Yet it ended as something far greater, a revelation of how the modern age would wage its wars. It was a crucible that tested nations, exposed arrogance, and reshaped the world's understanding of conflict. When the smoke cleared, the map of Europe remained largely the same, but the hearts and minds of its people were irrevocably changed. The fields of Balaclava, Inkerman, and Sevastopol became symbols not of glory, but of endurance and loss. For Russia, the defeat was a painful awakening. The empire that had once stood proud and unchallenged now faced the undeniable truth of its own stagnation. The Crimean War exposed the inefficiency of its bureaucracy, the weakness of its logistics, and the backwardness of its serf-based economy. Tsar Alexander II took these lessons to heart. In the years that followed, he embarked on a series of sweeping reforms, abolishing serfdom, modernizing the military, and pushing for industrial development. Though born of defeat, these changes set Russia on a new path toward modernization. Yet the sting of humiliation would remain, simmering beneath the surface, driving the empire to seek redemption in future conflicts. The Ottoman Empire, too, emerged scarred but alive. The war had demonstrated that the sick man of Europe was not yet ready to collapse. With the help of British and French allies, the empire had managed to preserve its sovereignty, though at an immense cost. The experience forced the Ottomans to recognize the necessity of reform, leading to the Tanzimat era of modernization, centralization, and administrative change. But the empire's survival came with dependence on European powers, a precarious balance that would define its final century. For Britain and France, the victory was both triumphant and sobering. The British public, once intoxicated by patriotic fervor, learned to see war not as an adventure, but as a grim, chaotic ordeal. The death toll, the logistical disasters, and the suffering of soldiers turned public opinion toward reform. In France, Napoleon III basked in temporary glory, his empire elevated by military success. Yet the war had drained resources and revealed the vulnerability of even the most advanced armies to disease, disorganization, and the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Both nations left Crimea victorious, but haunted by the human cost of their triumph. The Crimean War also transformed the nature of journalism and public perception. For the first time, correspondents like William Howard Russell sent vivid reports from the front lines, their words carried by telegraph to a waiting world. Photographs captured the faces of soldiers, the wreckage of battlefields, and the grim truth behind patriotic slogans. Ordinary citizens could now see war as it was, muddy, chaotic, and merciless. This transparency altered the relationship between governments, armies, and the public, giving rise to the modern war correspondent and shaping how societies viewed military power. Yet, among all its brutality, the war gave rise to enduring humanity. Florence Nightingale's tireless service revolutionized medicine, proving that compassion and discipline could save as many lives as any victory. Her work inspired a new generation of nurses and laid the foundations for modern healthcare. Similarly, the courage of soldiers from across continents, British, French, Ottoman, Sardinian, and Russian, reminded the world that even amid the worst of suffering, honor and resilience could endure. By the time peace settled over the Black Sea, Europe had been irrevocably changed. The Crimean War was not a grand victory of conquest or ideology, but a mirror held to an era standing on the edge of transformation. It exposed the fragility of empires, the cost of ambition, and the dawn of industrial warfare. It was a warning, a reminder that the next century would not be ruled by chivalry, but by iron, technology, and the will to endure unimaginable loss. The war's legacy lived on not in parades or monuments, but in lessons carved into history. The courage of the common soldier, the suffering of the wounded, and the quiet resolve of those who tended to them became the true measure of its memory. As the ashes of Sevastopol cooled and the world moved forward, the Crimean War stood as a turning point, a chapter where the old world of empires collided with the new world of modernity. In its wake, Europe would never be the same again. The jungle breathes like a living thing, shrouded in mist and memory. Beneath its canopy, echoes of a war long gone still whisper through the leaves. In the 1960s, This land became the center of a global storm, a conflict that would test nations, shatter families, and redefine how the world understood power. The Vietnam War. For some, it was a fight for freedom. For others, it was resistance against foreign domination. But for everyone who lived through it, it was a tragedy written in fire, blood, and conviction. It began in the shadows of another war. World War II had just ended, leaving behind broken empires and rising superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union stood locked in a silent duel, the Cold War, fighting not through armies but through ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus revolution. Every nation caught between those forces became a battlefield of influence, and none would burn brighter than Vietnam. In the north, Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary who had once studied in Europe and admired America's fight for independence, dreamed of a free, unified Vietnam. To him, colonialism was the enemy, and communism was the path to liberation. In the south, Western powers backed Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist leader who promised stability and independence. But beneath that promise, corruption and oppression festered. As the jungles filled with whispers of rebellion, American advisors began to arrive, armed not just with weapons, but with a belief that stopping communism in Vietnam would stop it from spreading across Asia. The Domino Theory took hold. If one country fell, others would follow. It was a simple idea that would cost millions of lives. The year was 1955. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, two halves of one wounded nation staring across a line drawn by outsiders. To the north, the red flag with a golden star. To the south, a government propped up by US dollars and military aid. Between them lay a future soaked in uncertainty. No one yet knew that this land of rice paddies and thick jungle would become the graveyard of American confidence. No one could foresee that the world's most powerful military would find itself tangled in a war it could not win. And no one could imagine how deeply this distant conflict would scar the American soul. This is the story of how it began. The seeds of division, the rise of a revolution, and the slow, inevitable march toward one of history's most devastating wars. The guns were still silent in the mid-1950s, but Vietnam was already at war with itself. The French had fallen at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, ending nearly a century of colonial rule. From that victory rose Ho Chi Minh, a man revered as a liberator by some and feared as a communist threat by others. The Geneva Accords followed, slicing Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel. In theory, it was temporary. Elections were promised to reunite the country, but they never came. The United States saw the North as a growing danger, a potential domino ready to topple the rest of Asia into the communist bloc. President Dwight D. Eisenhower pledged support to the South, and soon, money and advisors began flowing in. Washington believed that Vietnam could be molded into a democratic stronghold, a shining example of American resolve in Southeast Asia. Ngo Dinh Diem rose to power in Saigon, handpicked and heavily supported by the U.S. At first, he appeared to be a solution, a nationalist, Catholic, and anti-communist leader who promised stability. But Diem's government quickly alienated much of the rural population. His regime favored the elite, suppressed Buddhist communities, and ruled with an iron hand. In the countryside, resentment smoldered. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh and his ministers built a socialist state focused on land reform and self-reliance. Thousands of landlords were executed in brutal purges, and collectivization reshaped village life. Yet, despite hardship, the people's loyalty to Ho's vision remained strong. Across the demilitarized zone, southern peasants, frustrated by Diem's oppression, began to organize, inspired by the northern call for revolution. By 1959, that unrest erupted into armed resistance. Former Viet Minh fighters regrouped in the jungles and marshes, forming what would become known as the Viet Cong. They struck government officials, sabotaged infrastructure, and spread fear throughout the countryside. To Diem and his American backers, these were communist terrorists. To others, they were freedom fighters reclaiming their land. Eisenhower's cautious involvement deepened under President John F. Kennedy. By 1961, U.S. military advisors numbered in the thousands. Helicopters, weapons, and supplies poured into South Vietnam. Kennedy believed that America could prevent another Korea, that limited force and modern tactics could crush a guerrilla movement. But Vietnam was not Korea. The enemy was not massed armies. It was shadows, villages, and faces that could not be easily distinguished from friend or foe. By 1963, Diem's regime was collapsing under its own weight. Buddhist monks set themselves on fire in protest. The streets of Saigon burned with anger. In November, Diem was assassinated in a coup, quietly backed by the CIA. Kennedy himself would be dead 3 weeks later. In the chaos that followed, America's role in Vietnam shifted from advising a government to trying to save it. The seeds of full-scale war had been sown. The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem left South Vietnam without a clear path forward. What followed was chaos. One military junta after another, each weaker and more unstable than the last. Corruption ran deep, morale crumbled, and the Viet Cong grew stronger in the countryside. To Washington, it looked like South Vietnam was slipping away. The United States had invested heavily in this fragile nation, and to abandon it now would mean conceding victory to communism. But saving it would demand something far greater than advisors and aid. It would require war. In the north, Ho Chi Minh watched with quiet patience. His government in Hanoi saw Diem's fall as an opportunity to unite the country under communist rule. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, an intricate network of dirt paths and jungle routes, began to expand across Laos and Cambodia. It carried weapons, supplies, and soldiers southward, hidden under the dense green roof of the forest. The North's strategy was simple: bleed the South slowly, undermine its government, and make the Americans exhaust themselves in a war of attrition. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy faced mounting pressure. Every report from Vietnam painted the same picture: an ally losing ground, an enemy growing stronger. Kennedy believed in the doctrine of containment, the idea that stopping communism in one place would protect freedom everywhere. Yet he also feared sending U.S. troops into another Asian war just years after Korea. Instead, he escalated America's presence quietly. By 1963, more than 16,000 U.S. military advisors were on the ground, training South Vietnamese forces, flying helicopters into battle, and providing logistical support. But training could not fix corruption, nor could equipment replace conviction. The South Vietnamese army lacked unity and purpose, while the Viet Cong fought with relentless determination. And then came November 1963. Diem was gone, assassinated by his own generals. The leadership vacuum deepened, and only 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was killed in Dallas. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited not just the presidency but a boiling crisis in Southeast Asia. Johnson, a man who prided himself on decisive action, vowed that America would not lose Vietnam. He saw the war not as a distant conflict, but as a test of America's willpower against communism itself. Early in his presidency, Johnson faced the incident that would change everything. In August 1964, U.S. naval ships, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Though the details were murky, Johnson seized the moment. He declared that American forces had been assaulted without provocation, and Congress responded with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him broad powers to use military force in Southeast Asia. It was, in effect, a declaration of war, without ever calling it one. The bombing began soon after. Operation Pierce Arrow struck North Vietnamese targets, signaling the beginning of direct American involvement. Yet even then, Johnson publicly insisted that the U.S. was not at war, only defending freedom. Behind closed doors, the Pentagon began planning for escalation. The dominoes were already falling. In 1965, the illusion of restraint finally shattered. The first wave of U.S. Marines landed in Da Nang, 500 men, armed and ready for combat. It was the first time American ground troops were officially deployed in Vietnam. The landing was met not with triumph, but with uncertainty. Soldiers stepped onto foreign soil, unsure of the enemy they would fight, or the mission they were meant to accomplish. Many believed they were there to protect villages, build roads, and secure democracy. Few realized they were walking into a quagmire that would last a decade. As American forces poured in, the conflict transformed. The skies filled with the roar of helicopters and fighter jets. Bases expanded across the south, and supply lines stretched from the Pacific to the Mekong Delta. Washington promised that overwhelming firepower and technology would bring a swift victory. But in the jungles, where the line between friend and enemy blurred, the war followed no conventional rules. The Viet Cong adapted quickly. They struck convoys, ambushed patrols, and vanished into the forests. They built tunnels beneath villages, hiding entire armies underground. They fought not to win battles, but to outlast their enemies. Every American success on paper was matched by another ambush, another explosion, another stretch of road that couldn't be secured. Back home, President Johnson's advisors spoke of progress and optimism. They promised that victory was near, that each escalation brought America closer to peace. But the truth was darker. The war was growing, and the body count was rising. For every village secured, another was lost. For every Viet Cong killed, more recruits emerged from the countryside. The line between strategy and desperation began to blur. Johnson authorized massive bombing campaigns, convinced that superior firepower could force Hanoi to negotiate. Yet the North remained defiant, its people hardened by years of struggle. "We will fight," Ho Chi Minh declared, 10 years, 20 years, as long as it takes. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. The conflict had become a full-scale war, a war fought in jungles and rice fields, on television screens, and in the hearts of two nations. The U.S. had crossed a point of no return. What began as a mission to defend democracy had become a test of endurance, one that neither side fully understood. The escalation was complete. The first chapter of America's longest war had truly begun. The year 1965 marked the beginning of a new phase in the Vietnam War. With American ground troops now deployed and the Viet Cong's reach expanding deeper into South Vietnam, Washington turned to the skies for dominance. The answer came in the form of Operation Rolling Thunder, a relentless bombing campaign aimed at breaking North Vietnam's will to fight. It was meant to be swift and decisive. Instead, it became one of the longest and most controversial air operations in history, a thunderstorm of destruction that raged for more than 3 years. Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, with hundreds of U.S. aircraft launching strikes on targets across North Vietnam. Bridges, factories, supply depots, and roads were reduced to rubble. The logic was simple: destroy the enemy's infrastructure, cripple their ability to wage war, and force them to the negotiating table. American pilots flew thousands of missions, dropping millions of tons of explosives, more than what was used in all of World War II's Pacific campaign. Each sortie was intended to send a message of power, but in the dense forests and hidden valleys of Vietnam, that message often vanished into smoke and mud. The North Vietnamese were not easily broken. Under Ho Chi Minh and his defense minister, Vong Nguyen Giap, they turned destruction into resilience. Roads destroyed by day were repaired by night. Bridges bombed into dust were replaced with bamboo structures in a matter of hours. Convoys moved under the cover of darkness, shielded by camouflage and protected by anti-aircraft guns hidden in the jungle. Entire villages volunteered to rebuild what the bombs tore apart. Rather than collapsing morale, Rolling Thunder hardened it. Deep in the mountains, the Ho Chi Minh Trail grew into a lifeline that defied American technology. It was more than a supply route. It was an underground empire of movement. Soldiers, porters, and bicycles, loaded with rice and ammunition, crossed into Laos and Cambodia, weaving through thick canopy that radar could not penetrate. Despite constant bombing, the trail never stopped. Every time the U.S. tried to sever it, it reappeared, alive and shifting like a phantom vein running down the spine of Indochina. Meanwhile, in the south, the air war's collateral damage was devastating. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were bombed or napalmed into silence. The earth itself burned as firestorms rolled over fields and homes. The use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange stripped the jungles bare, turning vibrant ecosystems into wastelands and poisoning generations of civilians. For every enemy destroyed, countless innocents suffered, and the line between target and bystander grew impossible to define. American pilots flew missions with staggering bravery, facing intense anti-aircraft fire and Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles. Each flight carried the risk of capture or death. Those shot down over the north were often taken prisoner and subjected to brutal conditions in camps like the infamous Hanoi Hilton. Yet even as losses mounted, the bombing continued, driven by the belief that persistence would eventually crush resistance. But the enemy's will could not be measured in destroyed targets or burned-out craters. The more bombs fell, the more determined Hanoi became. Giap understood that America's real weakness was not on the battlefield. It was in its politics and public opinion. He believed that if they could endure the bombs, if they could survive the storm, the Americans would eventually lose the will to continue. It was a strategy of endurance versus technology, patience against firepower. Inside the Pentagon, doubts began to surface. Intelligence reports showed that Rolling Thunder had failed to significantly reduce North Vietnam's ability to supply its troops in the south. Civilian casualties were fueling anger around the world, and photographs of napalm-burned children began to reach American newspapers. Still, President Johnson and his advisors refused to admit defeat. They were trapped by their own promises. To scale back would signal weakness. To press forward would deepen the quagmire. The bombing expanded northward, closer to Hanoi and Haiphong, but the results were the same. North Vietnamese resolve held firm, and anti-aircraft defenses grew more deadly. Each new escalation brought diminishing returns. The jungles absorbed the shock, the enemy adapted, and the skies filled with smoke that hid the truth. The air war was failing. On the ground, the impact was both physical and psychological. South Vietnamese civilians fled their homes in terror, entire provinces reduced to ruins. The Viet Cong, though suffering losses, used the devastation as propaganda, portraying themselves as defenders of the homeland against a foreign invader. For many villagers, loyalty was no longer about ideology. It was about survival. By 1967, Rolling Thunder had dropped nearly 1 million tons of bombs, yet the North still stood defiant. Factories continued to operate, supplies kept flowing, and the will to resist remained unbroken. In Washington, frustration turned to disbelief. How could a small, rural nation withstand the might of the world's most powerful military? The answer lay not in the skies, but in the hearts of those who refused to surrender. Operation Rolling Thunder was meant to be America's hammer blow, the strike that would bring North Vietnam to its knees. Instead, it became a symbol of the war's futility, a demonstration of immense power achieving little lasting effect. The thunder roared for years, but when the echoes faded, the jungle remained, silent and waiting. The bombing had not ended the war. It had only deepened it, setting the stage for an even bloodier struggle to come. The jungles of Vietnam swallowed sound, light, and men alike. Beneath the thick canopy, the air was heavy with moisture and fear. It was a world where every rustle could be an ambush, every path a trap. American soldiers arrived with the confidence of a nation that had never lost a war. They carried M16 rifles, radios, and the belief that technology would triumph over terrain. But the jungle cared nothing for power or pride. It devoured both with the same quiet hunger. By 1966, the war had shifted fully to the ground. The United States launched massive search-and-destroy operations, aiming to root out Viet Cong strongholds and measure progress through body counts. Villages were searched, crops were burned, and the jungle was carved open by artillery and bulldozers. Yet the enemy refused to fight conventionally. They appeared from nowhere, struck with precision, and vanished into the green abyss. The soldiers called them ghosts, shadows that moved through the trees and tunnels as if the jungle itself fought alongside them. The Battle of Ia Drang in late 1965 had given America its first true taste of the enemy's ferocity. It was a clash of two worlds, American helicopters and air power against North Vietnamese discipline and strategy. The battle raged for days, with both sides suffering heavy losses. American commanders declared it a victory, but to the North Vietnamese, it was proof that the Americans could be matched and bled. What the US saw as triumph, the enemy saw as invitation. In the following years, the war became a grind of endless patrols and ambushes. Soldiers were sent deep into the countryside with orders to engage the enemy wherever they found him. But the Viet Cong were everywhere and nowhere. They moved through a labyrinth of tunnels stretching for miles, underground cities, complete with hospitals, storage rooms, and command centers. Above ground, they melted into the villages, disguised as farmers by day and fighters by night. The Americans, unable to distinguish friend from foe, began to distrust everyone. In that confusion, atrocities took root. Every hill captured seemed to be lost again within days. The search and destroy strategy turned the countryside into a battlefield with no front lines, only endless repetition. Units like the 1st Cavalry and 25th Infantry were sent on missions with vague objectives: kill the enemy, count the bodies, and move on. Commanders measured success not by ground gained, but by statistics, creating a war fought through numbers instead of meaning. It was a system that rewarded destruction but not progress. Helicopters became the lifeline of the war, the sound of their blades echoing across valleys and rice paddies. They brought supplies, evacuated the wounded, and delivered death from above. To the soldiers, they were salvation and damnation at once. The bird would come screaming out of the sky, its door gunners raining bullets into the trees while the jungle answered back with fire. In those moments, life and death existed only in seconds. To combat the elusive enemy, the U.S. unleashed devastating firepower. Artillery barrages leveled forests, and B-52 bombers carpeted entire regions with explosives. Chemical warfare followed. Herbicides like Agent Orange sprayed from planes to strip away the Viet Cong's cover. The jungle turned to ash, rivers glowed with poison, and generations would pay for the contamination that followed. Villagers developed strange illnesses, children were born deformed, and the land itself became an open wound. For the men fighting, the war was both external and internal. Days blurred into each other under the crushing heat and constant fear. They lived in mud, slept under rain, and fought enemies they rarely saw. The smell of gunpowder mixed with rotting vegetation and the metallic tang of blood. Letters from home became lifelines, fragile reminders that a world still existed beyond the jungle. But even those letters began to sound foreign. For many, the war became their only reality. Camaraderie kept them alive. Platoons became families forged in the crucible of survival. A soldier would risk his life for the man beside him, even when he no longer believed in the mission. Heroism and horror existed side by side, often in the same heartbeat. Some soldiers returned from patrols silent and empty-eyed, their souls left somewhere between the trees and the screams. Others hardened into ghosts long before they died. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fought with patience and discipline. They moved supplies through the night, used hidden tunnels to ambush convoys, and fought knowing that every fallen comrade would be replaced. Their tactics relied on time, on making the war last long enough for the Americans to grow tired. They believed that endurance would defeat technology, and in the jungles of Vietnam, endurance was their greatest weapon. As the years passed, frustration grew. Soldiers questioned why they were there, what they were fighting for, and who was telling the truth. Reports sent back to Washington spoke of progress, but on the ground, progress was measured in lives lost. Each victory felt hollow, each mission temporary. The enemy always returned. The jungle always took back what was cleared. By 1967, morale had begun to erode. Drug use spread through the ranks, discipline wavered, and trust in leadership faded. The line between survival and duty blurred completely. Some units fired into the jungle without seeing a single enemy, convinced that the trees themselves were watching. It was a war of exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, humanity began to crumble. Yet even in despair, moments of courage endured. Medics carried wounded men through gunfire. Pilots flew into impossible zones to rescue survivors. Soldiers shared their last rations with frightened villagers. Amid the madness, pieces of humanity remained, fragile but unbroken. The war in the jungle was not defined by territory or victory. It was a struggle of endurance fought in silence and rain, between men who barely understood why they were killing each other. For every bomb dropped, another fighter rose from the shadows. For every hill captured, another was lost to the green. The jungle took everything: sound, light, reason, and left behind only echoes. It was here, in this living nightmare, that the myth of American invincibility began to die. In the early months of 1968, Vietnam seemed trapped in endless repetition. American forces controlled the cities by day, while the Viet Cong ruled the countryside by night. The U.S. military claimed victory after victory, reporting inflated body counts and declaring that the enemy's will to fight was nearly broken. Washington promised that the end was in sight, but far from the cameras and press briefings, in the tunnels and jungles of North Vietnam, plans were being set in motion for an assault that would shake the world. The North Vietnamese called it the General Offensive and Uprising. The world would remember it as the Tet Offensive. Tet was the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a sacred time of peace and family, when both sides traditionally paused the fighting. But in January 1968, that peace became the perfect disguise. Under the cover of the holiday, tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops prepared to strike. They smuggled weapons into cities, buried ammunition beneath homes, and moved undetected through villages where no one suspected what was coming. When the first attacks began in the early hours of January 30th, the silence of the night exploded into chaos. More than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam came under simultaneous assault. From the highlands to the Mekong Delta, gunfire erupted where there had been celebration only hours before. The Viet Cong stormed provincial capitals, military bases, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. In Hue, an ancient imperial city, the battle would rage for nearly a month. The surprise was total. American intelligence had not foreseen the scale or coordination of the offensive. In Saigon, Viet Cong commandos breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy compound, engaging in close-quarters combat just yards from the nerve center of American operations. Marines fought room to room, retaking the embassy after fierce resistance. Though the attack failed militarily, the psychological damage was immense. Images of Viet Cong fighters inside what was supposed to be the safest American stronghold spread across the globe, shattering the illusion that victory was near. In Hue, the fighting reached medieval brutality. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong seized large parts of the city, executing officials, police, and anyone suspected of collaboration. The U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese forces counterattacked, supported by heavy artillery and airstrikes that reduced much of Hue to ruins. When the city was finally recaptured after weeks of combat, the bodies of thousands of civilians were found in mass graves. The Tet Offensive had turned one of Vietnam's most beautiful cities into a cemetery. Militarily, the offensive was a disaster for the North. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic losses, their ranks decimated by American firepower. Entire units were wiped out, and the countryside was littered with the dead. Yet, in a cruel paradox, the North had achieved something far greater than battlefield success. It had destroyed the American public's faith in the war. For years, officials in Washington and military commanders in Saigon had assured the world that the U.S. was winning. Tet exposed those claims as hollow. Television brought the horror into American living rooms. Firefights in Saigon streets, Marines dragging wounded comrades through Hue's rubble, civilians running from burning villages. For the first time in modern history, the reality of war played out nightly on television screens. The American people saw not victory, but chaos. They saw young men dying in a war with no visible end. Public opinion shifted overnight. The belief in progress collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. Confidence in the government eroded, and protests in the United States swelled to unprecedented levels. University campuses erupted with anger, and draft resistance became a movement of its own. Families divided over the question of patriotism and purpose. Support for President Lyndon B. Johnson crumbled, and for the first time, the most powerful nation on earth began to doubt itself. Inside the White House, the shock was equally profound. Johnson's advisors admitted that the war could no longer be won through military means. The United States had achieved every tactical goal, but suffered a strategic catastrophe. The cost of each victory was measured not in land, but in credibility. The Tet Offensive had exposed the truth that the enemy's strength lay not in weapons, but in endurance. As spring approached, Johnson addressed the nation with weary honesty. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and declared his intention not to seek re-election. His voice trembled with exhaustion, the tone of a man who had given everything to a cause that no longer made sense. The torch of leadership passed to a country deeply divided and unsure of what victory even meant. On the ground, the aftermath of Tet left scars that could not be erased. The cities lay in ruins, the jungles filled with the stench of death, and entire regions of South Vietnam were depopulated. Villagers wandered through burned-out towns searching for lost relatives. American soldiers who had fought with unimaginable courage now carried the weight of disillusionment. They had won the battles but lost the reason to keep fighting. The North Vietnamese withdrew to rebuild, bloodied but unbroken. The Viet Cong, though shattered, became symbols of defiance. They had shown that no place was safe, that even the mightiest nation could be caught off guard. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh watched his vision inch closer to reality, knowing that the war had shifted in his favor not because of the battlefield, but because of belief. The Tet Offensive changed everything. It was not a victory of weapons, but of will. Not a triumph of armies, but of perception. The war in Vietnam was no longer about who could win. It was about who could endure. From that moment on, America's question was no longer how do we win, but how do we get out? The Jungle War had reached its turning point, and though the fighting would continue for years, the outcome had already begun to take shape in the hearts of those who had seen too much. By 1969, the war had entered a grim new phase. The Tet Offensive had shattered illusions of victory, yet the killing never stopped. The United States began to talk of Vietnamization, a plan to shift the burden of fighting onto the South Vietnamese army while slowly withdrawing American troops. On paper, it was a strategy of transition. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to step back from a conflict that had consumed a generation. President Richard Nixon promised peace with honor, but behind those words, the war expanded into darker corners. Secret bombings rained down on Cambodia and Laos, meant to cut off the enemy's supply lines, but they only widened the circle of destruction. For soldiers still in the jungles, talk of peace felt like a cruel joke. Patrols trudged through swamps and elephant grass, ambushed by enemies who vanished into the trees. Every village was a question mark, every face a potential threat. The war had no clear front lines, no safe zones, only endless uncertainty. Men measured survival one day at a time, their eyes hollowed by the weight of things they could not explain when they returned home. Napalm burned through forests and flesh alike, leaving landscapes that looked like the surface of another planet. The roar of B-52s became a constant thunder, and yet, even after millions of tons of bombs, the enemy kept coming. In the United States, the streets turned into battlegrounds of another kind. The anti-war movement grew louder, angrier, more determined. College students filled campuses with chants and banners, demanding an end to the bloodshed. Mothers marched with photos of their sons, soldiers protested in uniform, and veterans threw their medals onto the Capitol steps. The line between patriotism and protest blurred as the nation tore itself apart. Kent State became a symbol of that divide, when National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4. The images of their lifeless bodies sprawled on the ground shocked the world. Every night, the television brought the war home. Villages on fire, helicopters lifting the wounded lifting each other. Reporters embedded with troops told stories that no government statement could erase. The credibility of authority had been shattered beyond repair. The country that once saw itself as the guardian of freedom was now forced to question what that word truly meant. For the first time, America was fighting 2 wars, one in Vietnam and one within itself. In Saigon, corruption ran deep through the South Vietnamese government. While the army fought bravely in many battles, morale suffered under the weight of politics and fear. Generals fought for power as much as for survival. Ordinary citizens tried to live between 2 worlds, caught between loyalty to the South and exhaustion from endless war. The markets buzzed by day, but the nights belonged to whispers, curfews, and gunfire. Nixon's administration claimed progress. They spoke of troop withdrawals and successful offensives, but the truth was written in body bags returning home under the cover of night. Vietnamization gave the illusion of control, yet it only shifted the suffering. American units pulled out, but the bombing intensified. In Cambodia, entire villages vanished beneath clouds of fire. The secret war left scars on lands that had never declared war on anyone. The bombing campaign, meant to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, instead destroyed countless lives, driving new recruits straight into the arms of the North Vietnamese. The soldiers who returned home did not come back to parades. They came back to silence, confusion, and anger. Many found themselves strangers in their own country, met not with gratitude but with accusations. They had fought in a war no one wanted to remember. Some tried to rebuild their lives, others could not escape the nightmares. The war had followed them back, living in their memories like a ghost that refused to leave. For those still fighting, the jungle became a kind of purgatory. The objective was unclear, the mission constantly changing. Villages were captured, abandoned, and recaptured again. The same ground was soaked in blood over and over. Some soldiers began to question not only the purpose of the war but their own sanity. Drug use spread through the ranks. Trust in command dissolved. A sense of aimlessness took hold, as if everyone knew the end was near but no one could say when it would come. In the north, Hanoi endured relentless bombings, yet its resolve did not waver. Each raid hardened their determination. Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969 only deepened the sense of destiny among his followers. They believed they were fighting for liberation, and no amount of American firepower could destroy that conviction. The war had become a machine that no one could stop. Each side was trapped by its own momentum. For America, it was about saving face. For the North, it was about survival and reunification. Between them lay millions of lives caught in the crossfire. The rivers ran red, the jungles burned, and the cities crumbled under the weight of promises that could no longer be kept. By 1972, Vietnamization had become an illusion too thin to maintain. The South Vietnamese army stood alone against a relentless enemy, and the United States, weary and divided, watched from afar. The once proud march of American power had turned into a slow, uncertain retreat. The echoes of artillery mixed with the echoes of protest, and both carried the same truth, that the war was no longer winnable and perhaps never had been. The world had changed. The soldiers who once believed they were fighting for freedom now fought simply to survive. The politicians who spoke of victory now spoke only of peace. And the people who once watched from their living rooms began to understand that the war in Vietnam was not just a distant tragedy, it was a mirror held up to everything they thought they knew about their country, their leaders, and themselves. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords finally brought a formal end to direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The negotiations had dragged on for years, marked by endless compromises, secret bombings, and mounting frustration on all sides. American troops, weary and disillusioned, began to return home, leaving South Vietnam to defend itself. For the soldiers, the withdrawal was both a relief and a betrayal. Relief that the fighting for American objectives was ending. Betrayal that the South Vietnamese, who had fought alongside them, would face the enemy alone. South Vietnam tried to hold its ground. The army, strengthened in theory by the Vietnamization program, was now fully responsible for defending cities and supply lines. Yet the challenges were immense. Morale was fragile, logistics were stretched, and corruption remained entrenched within the government. Villages that had survived years of war now teetered on the edge of collapse. The North had not disappeared. They were regrouping, preparing for the final push that would determine the fate of the entire country. Meanwhile, in the North, Hanoi bided its time. Leaders understood that the Americans, politically exhausted and economically strained, could no longer sustain the war effort. They stockpiled weapons, trained new recruits, and studied the weaknesses of the South Vietnamese army. For them, victory required patience, precision, and timing. They knew that one decisive offensive could collapse the South in a matter of weeks. The years following the U.S. withdrawal were tense. Sporadic fighting continued, but the absence of American troops created both a vacuum and an opportunity. Cities and towns that had relied on U.S. air power for protection were left vulnerable. The North pressed their advantage cautiously at first, testing the defenses, probing weaknesses, and exploiting every mistake. By early 1975, it was clear that the South could not hold. Then came the final offensive. North Vietnamese forces moved swiftly and decisively, sweeping through the Central Highlands and down toward Saigon. Entire provinces fell with astonishing speed. The South Vietnamese army, overstretched and demoralized, could not stop the advance. Civilians fled in panic, clogging roads with cars, motorcycles, and bicycles, carrying what little they could. The air was filled with the sounds of artillery, screaming sirens, and the constant rumble of tanks advancing through towns and countryside alike. Saigon, once a bustling capital, became a city gripped by fear. Rumors spread faster than information, and panic took hold. American citizens and Vietnamese allies scrambled to leave, desperate to escape the approaching North Vietnamese forces. The evacuation of the U.S. Embassy was chaotic and urgent. Helicopters lifted thousands from rooftops, while others climbed into aircraft any way they could. Families were separated, possessions abandoned, and the city's skyline became a tableau of desperation. By April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, breaking through the gates with ease. The South Vietnamese government collapsed almost instantly. Soldiers deserted their posts, leaving cities and villages exposed. The flag of South Vietnam was lowered for the last time, and the red flag with a golden star was raised over the presidential palace. It was the end of a 20-year struggle, a war that had claimed millions of lives and reshaped the world's perception of America. The streets were filled with survivors, wanderers, and the broken. Some rejoiced at reunification, others mourned lost family members and destroyed homes. The consequences of the war extended far beyond the battlefield. Cities were devastated, farmlands destroyed, and generations scarred by trauma. Those who had survived now faced the immense challenge of rebuilding a nation from the ruins. In America, the fall of Saigon became a symbol of failure and loss. Television images captured the final moments. Helicopters lifting desperate people from rooftops, tanks rolling down abandoned streets, and families clinging to the last threads of hope. For the soldiers who had returned home years earlier, it was confirmation of the bitter truth. They had fought bravely, but the war had not ended as they had imagined. For Vietnam, the conclusion was absolute. The North's victory brought the country together under a single communist government, fulfilling the vision that had guided Ho Chi Minh and his successors for decades. Yet unification came at a cost. Millions of lives lost, landscapes scarred, and a society fractured by decades of conflict faced the immense task of healing. The war had ended, but its consequences would linger for generations. The fall of Saigon marked not just the collapse of South Vietnam, but the end of America's long, painful experiment in Southeast Asia. The world had witnessed a conflict where military power alone could not guarantee victory, where endurance and will proved stronger than technology, and where the human cost of war transcended any map or strategy. The Vietnam War was over, but its lessons and its ghosts would not be forgotten. The war was over, yet its echoes remained, reverberating through the lives of those who had survived and the nations that had sent them to fight. For the United States, the Vietnam War left scars deeper than any battlefield could reveal. Over 58,000 American soldiers had died, tens of thousands more wounded, and countless others returned home with invisible injuries, post-traumatic stress that haunted their dreams, their relationships, and their sense of purpose. Families mourned sons, brothers, and husbands, while grappling with the knowledge that the war they had supported, or protested, had ended in defeat. It was a national wound that would not heal for years. In Vietnam, the cost was staggering. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers had perished. Entire villages were destroyed, rice paddies turned to ash, and jungles stripped bare by bombs and chemicals. Agent Orange left a lasting mark, causing deformities and illness that would affect generations. Cities once vibrant with life lay in ruins, their streets haunted by memories of violence and betrayal. Survivors faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just homes and infrastructure, but trust and community. Reconciliation was difficult, as the wounds of war extended into the fabric of society itself. The political consequences were equally profound. In the United States, the war undermined public trust in government. The credibility gap between official statements and reality shattered confidence in leaders and institutions. Vietnam forced a reckoning. The military could be the most powerful in the world, yet victory was not guaranteed. Lessons about the limits of force, the importance of clear objectives, and the danger of underestimating an enemy became central to American foreign policy for decades. Yet these lessons were learned painfully and at a tremendous human cost. For the soldiers who survived, the war was a lifelong shadow. Many struggled to reintegrate into society, carrying memories of jungles, ambushes, and comrades lost. Veteran support programs were initially inadequate, and public sentiment was divided. Heroes to some, villains to others, misunderstood by a society unsure how to confront the war it had waged and lost. Vietnam veterans became a generation marked not just by service but by survival in a conflict that had tested them beyond measure. In Vietnam, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The communist government began the difficult work of rebuilding, reuniting the North and South, and restoring governance across a devastated country. Land reforms, education campaigns, and infrastructure projects sought to heal decades of conflict. Yet the psychological and cultural scars remained. Survivors carried stories of fear, resistance, and endurance that would shape Vietnam's identity for generations. The Vietnam War also left an enduring lesson for the world. It demonstrated that military might alone could not resolve deeply rooted political and social struggles. Technology and firepower were powerless against strategy, resilience, and belief. It became a cautionary tale for superpowers, a reminder that ideology and determination often outweighed bombs and bullets. Historians, soldiers, and civilians alike would study its consequences for decades, seeking to understand how one of the world's most powerful nations could falter against a smaller, determined enemy. Yet amid the devastation, there was endurance and resilience. Communities rebuilt, veterans found new lives, and the nation slowly healed. In Vietnam, rivers ran through restored rice paddies, children returned to schools, and markets hummed with life once more. Across the United States, veterans and families sought closure, speaking openly about their experiences and ensuring that the sacrifices were not forgotten. Memory became a form of survival, and remembrance became a bridge between generations. Ultimately, the Vietnam War was more than a conflict over territory or ideology. It was a struggle that tested humanity, endurance, and morality. It reshaped nations, altered foreign policy, and left an indelible mark on the world. For those who fought, those who watched, and those who survived, it was a war that defined a generation and changed the way the world understood courage, sacrifice, and the cost of ambition. The wounds it left would fade slowly, but the lessons, the stories, and the memories would endure forever. The Vietnam War ended, but its shadows stretched far beyond the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. It was a war that defied expectations, one that tested not just armies, but nations, families, and the very idea of purpose in conflict. For the United States, the war was a lesson in humility and the limits of power. The images of helicopters lifting desperate refugees from rooftops, the harrowing stories of ambushed patrols, and the relentless reports of casualties created a collective memory that refused to fade. The war was broadcast into living rooms every night, making distant battlefields an intimate part of the American consciousness. No longer was victory measured by territory gained or enemy killed. It became a question of endurance, resilience, and human cost. Across Vietnam, the cost was immeasurable. Millions of civilians had died, and countless more were wounded or displaced. Cities were reduced to rubble, villages burned, and farmland poisoned by napalm and chemical defoliants. Families mourned children, siblings, and parents lost to violence that seemed endless. Yet, even in devastation, Vietnam endured. Communities rebuilt, markets reopened, and children returned to schools. Life returned gradually, painstakingly, a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming destruction. The land, scarred and poisoned, began the slow process of healing, but the psychological wounds carried by survivors would last for generations. For the soldiers who had fought, the war's conclusion was bittersweet. American troops returned home to a divided country, sometimes greeted with indifference, sometimes with anger. Many carried invisible scars, post-traumatic stress, guilt, and memories that refused to fade. Some found solace in reconnecting with family and community, while others struggled in silence, haunted by the jungles, ambushes, and the faces of comrades lost. Veterans of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces also faced the challenge of reintegration. They had fought for years under extreme conditions, and now they faced the task of rebuilding a unified nation from the ruins of war. Politically, the war reshaped global perspectives on conflict. It revealed that military might alone could not secure victory, especially in an enemy's homeland, where endurance, strategy, and belief outweighed technology and firepower. The lessons of Vietnam influenced U.S. foreign policy for decades, instilling caution, skepticism, and a deep awareness of the human costs of intervention. Nations around the world watched closely, understanding that ideology and resolve often outweighed bombs and bullets, and that no superpower was invincible when faced with determined resistance. Yet amid tragedy, there were moments of resilience and hope. Survivors rebuilt communities, veterans became advocates for peace, and families worked to preserve the memory of those lost. The stories of courage, endurance, and humanity persisted, offering lessons for future generations. Vietnam itself emerged from the war with a renewed sense of identity and unity, shaped by struggle and sacrifice, yet committed to rebuilding a nation torn apart by decades of violence. The Vietnam War was more than a conflict of politics and ideology. It was a human story of endurance, suffering, and survival. It reshaped nations, altered global perspectives, and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the world. For the soldiers, the civilians, and the leaders, it was a war that challenged beliefs, tested courage, and revealed the profound costs of ambition and intervention. The echoes of gunfire and helicopters may have faded, but the lessons, the stories, and the memories remain. Vietnam endures, America endures, and the world endures, with the memory of a war that taught that true victory is measured not just by power, but by resilience, humanity, and the strength to survive even the darkest of times.